Good afternoon. In this lecture, we'll be looking at the programmatic music of the Romantic period. This is Chapter 18, Part 1. The Romantic Orchestra. Now, during the Romantic period, we start to see a couple things happen with the orchestra. Obviously, we're getting more instruments, and the instruments themselves are getting better. So we see here louder and larger is better. Well, and that's kind of a staple of the Romantic period. We see more brass instruments and more wind instruments in the orchestra. And since we're adding more brass and winds, we have to add more strings to kind of balance everything out. In addition, we start to see a lot of technological advances in instruments. And when we look at especially brass instruments, we start to see valves on horns and valves and trumpets, which makes they can play a larger range, and they can play in different keys, okay? And they become more versatile. And that's kind of essential to brass instruments. And we see here, you'll see a French horn pictured here. And when I talk about the valves, it's all like the inner workings here. Before this, what they had to do is you just had this big circle here with the French horn, and then you had the bell. And if you wanted to change keys, you'd actually have to take the horn apart and reconfigure it and add more pipes. These pipes were called crooks. And musicians would do this during symphony, like concerts. If they're changing keys, they'd stop, take apart the horn, add more pipe to it to change change the key. But now that we have all this valve system, it makes things so much more easier, and they become much more versatile. Another thing that happens with the Romantic orchestra is we see a lot of new instruments being added. Okay. So we definitely have the flutes, the clarinets, and the oboes, just like we'll have the French horns, the trumpets, and so forth. But we start to see additional instruments, or kind of like the instrument, like their auxiliary instruments, or like the cousins of instruments. An example like the piccolo. The piccolo becomes a staple of the winds. It's a smaller flute, and it's the highest of the instruments that can be played in the orchestra. The trombone and tuba are in the brass section, and again, we're adding more bass. The English horn is another one, and of course the contrabassoon, which is basically it's a larger bassoon that can play lower notes. So these instruments will add more dynamic range and definitely much more timbre or more color. Another thing that happens when we start to see these symphonies is they're going to get longer in length. Each movement is, instead of being a 20-minute symphony, but might be a half hour, 40 minutes. The composers have a lot more to say with these symphonies. Program music. Now, one of the big inventions or new aesthetical genres that comes out in the 19th century is what we call programmatic music. And we see examples beforehand, but definitely this new kind of music is really, really utilized in the Romantic period. Now, what is program music? Program music basically is having your music tell us a set story, okay, or tell a narrative. Maybe they're depicting events of a play or a poem. Maybe they're trying to express emotions. But something external, like an external story, is being portrayed through music. Okay. And again, it could be a play, a legend, a poem, a novel. It could be a historical event. Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture is based on a historical event, So we do have specific gestures can invoke particular feelings and associations. A lyrical melody might be in love. Dissonance might be a sense of conflict. Trumpet calls might be the arrival of a hero. And what we're doing is, in essence, we're trying to create music that's going to paint a musical picture, okay? A lot of this comes out of the strong connection to the literature of the 19th century. Because keep in mind, art literature, music, everything's kind of they're going parallel to each other, and they're influencing each other. And we see a huge literary movement in the 19th century. The publishing of books is huge. People are cranking out novels between from Jane Austen to Bram Stoker's Dracula and Frankenstein and so forth. So you have all these different types of novels coming out. Now, the difference between programmatic music is going to have a storyline to it, and it's contrasted by a term what we're going to call absolute music. Absolute music is just music with no other extra musical program or reference. And lots of Johannes Brahms, a lot of his music is all absolute music. Okay, most music in the classical period is all absolute music. Mozart's symphonies or Haydn's string quartets, it's just music. We're going to listen to it, and he's not trying to tell a story behind it. Okay, but on the flip side of it, I use Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture or his Romeo and Juliet Overture. Well, that's programmatic. Tchaikovsky is going to tell us a story through his music. Continuing talking about programmatic music, there are three main genres that come out that are programmatic, and they're pretty apparent in the 19th century. So we start to see programmed symphonies, dramatic overtures, and the idea of a tone poem or symphonic poem. Now, I would say dramatic overtures and tone poems are probably the most popular. But we'll start. A programmed symphony basically is a multi-movement piece that has a program or a narrative through it. It's going to be 3, 4, 5 movements, and it's going to depict a succession of specific events or scenes. Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, it's a programmed symphony. Okay. The next will be an overture. Okay, an overture is a dramatic overture. I'll say. It's a one-movement piece that portrays music through a sequence of dramatic events. Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture is exactly that. He's portraying the War of 1812. Rossini's Overture to the William Tell is another example. And then finally, the tone poem. And a tone poem is a one-movement orchestral work that is. It gives musical expression and emotions to a story. It could be a play, a political event, or personal experience. And this you have a plethora of. Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet is the one we'll look at in this class. Smetana's Ma Vlast is a series of tone poems. Liszt writes a tone poem called Les Preludes, or the Preludes of Life. And again, it's a huge popular form in the 19th century. Now, the first person we're going to talk about is Hector Berlioz. Berlioz is a French composer, and he's a very important composer. And he writes this programmed symphony called Symphonie Fantastique. He was born in Grenoble, France. His father was a doctor. Berlioz did have very little music training until he entered the Paris Conservatory. So, when you first of all, so a conservatory is basically a school of music or arts, but basically you're not doing any other. You're just focusing on music. All the classes are music classes. There's no science or math classes, or you don't have to take English classes and so forth. And back in the 19th century, you would have most big towns would have a conservatory. And again, it's hard to get into. A little anecdote, Berlioz first off went to med school because his father was a doctor, and his dad wanted him to be a medical student. And back then, what happened was they practiced on when you learn in the medical field, they practiced on cadavers. And so I think Berlioz was like first or second day there. They're cutting these cadavers open, and that was it. That was like Berlioz, like no thank you. And he drops out of med school and sticks with music. And we're lucky because he's a phenomenal composer. He's one of the first composers to earn a living as a music critic, And we do see the idea of people writing about music and reviewing concerts that comes out in the 19th century, and it's very, very influential. One thing that he does do, he's very skilled in orchestration. Now, orchestration is the idea that you're going to write a piece, but it's what instruments are going to be playing the melodies, what instruments are going to be playing the harmonies. And in the 19th century, we have this expanded orchestra, and the idea of writing for this orchestra becomes a lot more complex and more challenging. So Berlioz himself, he's adding more instruments to his compositions. The Offenklide, the English horn. He adds the harps, cornet, even saxophone. And his compositions are going to require more musicians and professional musicians. And in addition, one of the things that he does in his life is he actually writes a book on orchestration, which is basically the skills needed for writing music for orchestra. He was very influenced in literature, especially Shakespeare. And Shakespeare, again, as I mentioned this before in a couple of other lectures, he had this resurgence in the Romantic period because a lot of people were romanticizing his plays and so forth. And he looked at himself as this romantic hero. Life epitomized the artist as this romantic hero. We see this idea of the starving artist come out as a narrative through the Romantic period. We also see the artist being on a level that you can't understand them because they're so lofty or high up there as well. So we do see these kind of ideas coming out of the Romantic period. The Symphonie Fantastique. Now, this is an important piece because it comes out in 1830, and symphonies are still it's a huge genre in the classical period. And after Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, composers are struggling with, how do we write a symphony better than Beethoven, or how do we take this genre, what can we do with it? Many composers were either scared to write symphonies or couldn't figure out what to do next, since Beethoven's Ninth was such a wonderful, magnificent piece, and so forth. And one of the solutions, and so forth, is Berlioz comes by and says, "Listen, I'm going to write a symphony, but I'm not going to do what Beethoven did. I'm going to take this genre and go in a different direction." And he does. And so he sets the symphony in 5 movements. And this basically, the story of a symphony is tell the life of an artist. Okay. And the subtitle is An Episode in the Life of an Artist. And this program is basically, it's his story. Okay. The program is inspired by Berlioz's unrequited love for Harriet Smithson. He's in love with this actress, and he tries courting her, he chases after her and so forth, and she rejects him for a long time. And so what does he do? He writes a symphony about her. It has 5 movements. Now, keep in mind, most typical symphonies have 4, so we're altering the movement structure. The first one's Reverie's Passion. The second one's a ball. Third one's going to be a scene in the countryside. The fourth one's the March to the Scaffold. And then the fifth one is a dream of a witch's Sabbath. And the fourth movement is what we normally look at, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next coming slides. Now, Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, it's got 5 movements. And one of the important things that helps connect each of the movements is the use of this idea of an idée fixe. Now, the idée fixe is a theme that gets presented in every single movement. Okay, it's the same theme throughout. However, what happens is this theme's going to be changing ever so slightly in each movement to represent the character or emotion within the movement. Okay, so it's a unified theme that represents the beloved. Now, his beloved is Harriet Smithson, this woman he's infatuated with. In fact, there's a picture right here. We can see, it's a drawing of her. So let me play. So this example is this theme that gets appeared in every single movement. Let's listen. and that it's going to appear in some variation. March to the Scaffold. Now, the March to the Scaffold is the fourth movement in Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, and this is the piece that really that everyone talks about. Okay, basically, the program and the idea behind it is, having realized that his love goes unnoticed, the artist poisons himself with opium. A dose of the narcotic too weak to kill him, but plunges in a sleep accompanied by these horrible visions. He dreams that he killed the one he loved and is condemned, led to the scaffold, and is now witnessing his execution. Okay. Now, mind you, this is his own storyline. Basically, he's in love with this woman. She's not having it. It's unrequited. He takes too much opium. He overdoses and has these hallucinations. Basically, he's dreaming that he kills her, and he's marched to the scaffold. And what he's going to do in this movement is he's going to portray these events musically in this movement. Okay, so we're going to hear the march to the scaffold. Okay. We're going to hear the drumming up to where the guillotine comes down. And then we're going to even hear that idée fixe come back. And we're even going to hear, when a guillotine chops your head off, the head goes in the bucket. And he portrays that musically. Okay? And this was very, very controversial in the 1830s. When this came out, people didn't know what to think about this. It was bizarre. It was odd. It was crazy. It was definitely very, very radical at the time. So bear that in mind. In this slide, I want to go through and I want to listen to some of the musical examples that are going to appear in the fourth movement. So the first example is Berlioz kind of recreating these military bands that would have been present at an execution. Let's listen. Next is this kind of jarring moment where the condemned is getting led to the scaffold. Let's listen to that. It's got a lot of low strings. It's got the low brass in there. Afterwards, we're going to hear this kind of triumphant march, and it's mimicking like the crowd cheering and roaring and so forth. Let's listen. Now, as we get closer, getting closer to the guillotine, his head going through and they're preparing, we hear this idée fixe. And basically, you're going to hear it, and that's him kind of, the music's representing him dreaming of his loved one. And you hear at the end, you hear this big cymbal crash, which is the guillotine coming down, and you hear these pizzicato, which is like his head coming off. It's very graphic for its time. Let's listen to it again. So the graphically orchestrated, we hear the severed head coming off. Let's hear it one more time. So yeah, you hear these little pizzicato there to kind of mimic that. And keep in mind, this was very, very, first of all, it was very graphic, number one, but it was unique for its time. No one had thought of this before. And so hence it was a very, very innovative symphony. Okay. This concludes part 1 of chapter 18. We're talking about the programmatic music and Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique.